The groom hid that he was a millionaire and came to the wedding in an old suit. The bride's reaction shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Olivier Blake had everything a man could want: wealth, power, influence. He had built his empire from nothing, rising from the unforgiving streets of Atlanta to become one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country. The world knew his name. Magazine covers bore his image, headlines lauded his achievements, and investors sought his approval. His companies shaped industries, dictated trends, and redefined the boundaries of innovation. Yet, despite the countless accolades, the private jets, and the luxury penthouses in New York and Los Angeles, he often found himself alone, staring out of his vast floor-to-ceiling windows, wondering why none of it seemed to matter anymore. The problem was never money. He had learned early that money could solve most things: hunger, security, access, even time. But money could never buy sincerity. It couldn't make people love you for who you were, only for what you had. That lesson had been drilled into him over and over again through women who seemed perfect at first, but whose affection quickly soured once they realized he was not merely a man, but a financial entity. He had tried every type: models, entrepreneurs, actresses, influencers, lawyers, journalists. Some had been stunning, others brilliant. But in the end, they had all failed the same test. There was always a moment, subtle but damning, when their gaze would shift, when their interest would cease to be about him as a person and turn toward what he could offer. He had watched it happen too many times not to recognize the pattern. It might come in the form of an offhand question about his net worth, a casual suggestion about a luxury vacation, or the way their eyes flickered at the sight of his cars and watches. No matter how genuine they seemed in the beginning, it was always just a matter of time before their true nature surfaced. For years, he had tried to ignore it. He convinced himself that love was a transaction, that every relationship had an element of expectation. After all, wasn't it natural for people to seek comfort, security, a better life? But the more he told himself this, the emptier he felt. Because deep down, he didn't just want a companion. He wanted to be seen. He wanted someone to look at him the way he looked at the world, with curiosity, wonder, and excitement. He wanted to be more than a bank account or a trophy. He wanted to be real to someone. But reality had been elusive. In recent years, he had stopped trying. His encounters with women had become nothing more than temporary distractions, shallow indulgences he barely remembered the next day. He found himself preferring solitude, surrounding himself with work, investing all his energy into building something greater than himself. His empire had become his refuge, his company the only entity he could truly trust. And yet, despite everything, the ache remained. Olivier didn't talk about it with anyone. Not with his business partners, not with his closest friends. They wouldn't understand. They envied his life, assuming he had everything they had ever dreamed of. How could he possibly complain when he had access to every luxury imaginable? But what they failed to see was that loneliness felt the same whether you lived in a penthouse or a one-bedroom apartment. Tonight, he sat alone in his Los Angeles mansion, the city stretching out in front of him like a glittering sea. The view was stunning, but it no longer impressed him. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the dim light. His phone vibrated next to him, a notification from one of his many social circles, an invitation to yet another exclusive event. He let it go unanswered. His days of chasing excitement and high-end clubs and gala dinners were long behind him. He had done it all. Monte Carlo, Paris, Ibiza, Dubai. He had danced with princesses, debated with billionaires, and sipped champagne worth more than some people's mortgages, and none of it had filled the void. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The weight of his success pressed on him in a way it never had before. He thought back to where it had all begun. The narrow streets of his childhood, the scent of fresh asphalt and summer rain, the laughter of kids playing outside late into the night. Back then, happiness had been so simple. A warm meal, a good joke, a dream worth chasing. There had been a purity to life before money complicated everything. And for the first time in a long while, he felt an overwhelming urge to go back to something real. He didn't know what that meant yet. He didn't know where it would take him. But somewhere, deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that something had to change. The morning began in the worst possible way. Olivier had barely slept the night before. His mind had been restless, pacing through a labyrinth of thoughts that had no clear end. He had turned off his phone, ignored the incessant emails, and tried to escape into the solitude of his own home. But silence could be a cruel thing. It forced a man to listen to the echoes of his own doubts. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through the panoramic windows of his penthouse, he was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, his mind clouded. The city outside was stirring, the streets below buzzing with people who had places to be, obligations to meet, lives to live. He envied them in a strange way, the simplicity of their routines, the predictability of their days. His own life had become anything but predictable. He lived in a world where one phone call could change the course of his fortune, where deals were measured in millions, and where success had long since stopped feeling like an accomplishment and more like an obligation. Still, there was work to do. He showered, dressed in his usual tailored suit, dark, impeccable, exuding the effortless confidence that the world expected of him. By the time he stepped into the elevator, his morning coffee untouched on the marble counter, he had already checked the stock market, scanned the latest financial reports, and replied to urgent emails. The drive to the office should have been uneventful. It was a routine he had done thousands of times, slipping into the back seat of his black Mercedes, barely acknowledging his driver, and using the commute to catch up on overnight developments. But today, nothing was working as it should. His driver was stuck in traffic miles away, unable to reach him in time. A glitch in the scheduling system had thrown off his carefully planned itinerary. And, to make matters worse, a last-minute issue had arisen at one of his research facilities. An experimental prototype of an AI-driven drone had malfunctioned during testing. The situation required his presence. Rather than wait for his driver, he did something he hadn't done in years. He called for a regular taxi. It felt almost absurd standing outside his pristine high-rise in downtown Los Angeles, waiting for an ordinary yellow cab like any other person. The valet at the building's entrance hesitated before opening the door for him, as if unsure whether a man of his stature should be seen in something so mundane. Olivier ignored the look and slid into the back seat. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick New York accent, barely glanced at him before pulling into traffic. The ride was slow. The city was congested with the usual morning rush, the streets thick with cars crawling forward in an endless stream of honking and frustration. Olivier barely noticed. He was lost in thought, his gaze drifting over the cityscape, the billboards advertising things he had long since stopped caring about, the pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalks, wrapped up in their own lives. When had he last walked down a street without a purpose? Without a destination dictated by business? When had he last felt like just another person, instead of someone always being watched, evaluated, measured? He didn't have an answer. By the time they reached the testing facility on the outskirts of the city, the sky had darkened with the promise of rain. The air smelled of asphalt and electricity, thick with that peculiar tension that comes before a storm. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Engineers moved briskly through the halls, speaking in hushed tones. The lead scientist, a wiry man in his 50s, approached him with a grim expression. "The drone's main navigation system failed mid-test," he said. "We're still assessing the damage." Olivier didn't need details. He could see the frustration in their eyes, the weight of a costly mistake hanging over them. He had built his companies on precision, on innovation, on the belief that nothing was impossible. And yet, technology had its flaws, as did people. He spent the next few hours immersed in the problem, discussing solutions, reviewing data, trying to determine where the failure had occurred. Somewhere in the midst of it all, he leaned against a workbench, rubbing his temples, exhaustion creeping into his bones. That was when he realized how much of a mess he had become. His tailored suit was ruined. A smear of oil streaked across the sleeve of his jacket. His tie was askew, his hair slightly disheveled. He caught his reflection in the metal surface of a nearby tool cart and almost didn't recognize himself. It had been a long time since he had looked anything less than perfect. A younger engineer walked past and hesitated. Mr. Blake, you might want to clean up before heading out." Olivier exhaled. No kidding. But there was nothing to be done. His spare clothes were in his car that was now in a garage somewhere downtown. His driver was still stuck in traffic, and the only available attire in the building was a set of standard-issue work coveralls. He considered his options. There was something strangely liberating about the idea of stepping away from his usual polished appearance, if only for a few hours. With a resigned smirk, he changed into the coveralls, rolling up the sleeves, and exchanged his ruined shoes for a pair of work boots. It was the most comfortable he had felt all day. By the time he left the facility, the sky had opened up, releasing a slow, steady drizzle that coated the world in a soft gray haze. He called for another taxi, but the wait time was longer than expected. Standing in the rain, he let his mind drift, watching as cars sped by on the wet pavement. That was when he saw it. A small, flickering neon sign in the distance. A roadside diner. It was nothing special. The kind of place that had probably been there for decades, unchanged, untouched by the glossy modernity of the city. The windows were fogged up from the warmth inside, the red and blue neon reflecting off the wet pavement. A thought crossed his mind, impulsive and uncharacteristic. A cup of coffee. A break from everything. Without hesitation, he walked toward the diner, the rain dampening his sleeves, the cool air biting against his skin. For once, he didn't think about the stock market, or the latest tech innovations, or the expectations placed upon him. For once, he let himself be just another man in the rain, stepping into a place where no one knew his name. The bell above the door gave a small metallic jingle as Olivier stepped inside the cafe. The scent of fresh coffee, fried bacon, and something sweet, pancakes maybe, curled into the air, blending with the low murmur of conversation. The place was old-fashioned, the kind of establishment that had existed long before sleek, minimalist espresso bars had taken over the city. The linoleum floors were worn, the red leather booths cracked with age, and the fluorescent light above the counter flickered slightly, casting a warm but uneven glow. It was small, but not empty. A few truckers sat hunched over their meals at the counter, their heavy jackets slung over the backs of their chairs. A waitress, older, with tired eyes and a name tag that read Linda, moved between tables, refilling coffee cups with the ease of someone who had been doing it for decades. In the farthest booth, a man with a newspaper sat quietly, barely acknowledging the world around him. No one looked at him. No one recognized him. For the first time in years, he felt invisible. Olivier hadn't realized how much he had craved that sensation, the anonymity of it, the freedom. He could be anyone right now. Just another man seeking shelter from the rain, another weary traveler stopping for a hot drink before moving on. No expectations, no assumptions. No one calculating what they could gain from being near him. He took a seat at the counter, exhaling slowly. His fingers traced the ridges of the salt and pepper shakers absent-mindedly as he glanced at the old, laminated menu propped against the napkin dispenser. The prices were laughably low: $4 for a full breakfast, $1.50 for coffee. Linda approached, a notepad in hand, not the slightest trace of recognition in her expression. "What can I get you, hon?" "Just a coffee, please," he said, his voice sounding almost foreign to him in this setting. She nodded, poured the coffee from a scratched-up metal pot, and slid the cup toward him. It was dark, probably overbrewed, and had the distinct burnt aroma of diner coffee that had been sitting too long on the hot plate. But when he took a sip, it was exactly what he had wanted. Simple, strong, without the pretentiousness of gourmet blends and personalized orders. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the place. The rain outside had picked up, tapping steadily against the large front window. There was something comforting about it. And then she walked in. The door creaked slightly as it opened, the cool air from outside sweeping in with her. He didn't notice her at first, not in any grand cinematic way at least. There was no slow-motion effect, no dramatic swell of music. Just a shift in the air, something barely perceptible, something that tugged at the edges of his attention. She moved easily, naturally, as if she had been here 100 times before. Her hair was damp from the rain, dark curls pulled back loosely, a few stray strands clinging to her skin. She wore a white t-shirt, slightly oversized, tucked casually into well-worn jeans. There was nothing extravagant about her, nothing designed to draw attention. And yet, he found himself watching. She slid onto a stool 2 seats away from him, shaking the rain from her sleeves. Linda approached her with a familiarity that suggested she was a regular. "The usual Ava?" "Ava." She nodded, offering a small, tired smile. "Yeah, thanks, Linda." Her voice was warm but unpolished, absent of the rehearsed charm he was so used to hearing from women in his world. There was no flirtation, no deliberate attempt to be alluring, just ease. Linda poured her a cup of coffee, and for a moment, Ava simply wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth sink into her fingers. Olivier should have looked away, should have gone back to his own coffee, to his own moment of quiet. But he didn't. There was something compelling about her, something unforced. He had spent so long surrounded by people who carefully curated every aspect of themselves, who sculpted their images with precision. She, in contrast, seemed utterly unbothered by how she was perceived. She took a slow sip of her coffee, and then, as if sensing his gaze, she glanced at him, not with immediate curiosity or interest, but with the kind of casual awareness that came from simply noticing someone nearby. And then, a second later, she smiled. Not the kind of smile he was used to, the calculated, practiced expressions of women who knew exactly what they were doing. This was something else. something real. It wasn't an invitation or an expectation, just a brief, natural response to another human being sitting near her. It caught him off guard. He hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had smiled at him like that. Without thinking, he nodded in acknowledgement. She turned back to her coffee, unconcerned, unaware of the way something inside him had shifted, and for reasons he didn't yet understand, he wanted to keep that moment from slipping away. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, a rhythmic pattern that softened the world beyond the cafe's walls. Inside, the warmth of the diner settled around them, wrapping the small space in a kind of quiet intimacy. The hum of conversation from the truckers at the far end of the counter faded into the background, blending with the occasional clatter of dishes and the low hum of an old jukebox that no one had bothered to turn off. Olivier sat still, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, though he had barely taken more than a sip since she had walked in. He wasn't sure why he was paying so much attention to her. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, the way she seemed completely at ease in a place like this, as if the rest of the world could fall away and she would still be content with nothing more than a cup of coffee and a moment of quiet. She didn't glance at him again, at least not in any way that suggested she was aware of his lingering attention. Instead, she stirred her coffee absently, as if lost in thought, her expression calm but not vacant. There was something about her presence, unhurried, effortless, that made him feel as though he had stepped outside of time for a moment, away from everything that usually dictated the rhythm of his days. He wasn't accustomed to starting conversations with strangers. In his world, introductions were orchestrated, purposeful, almost transactional. You met people because it was expected, because there was something to gain, because the right connections could open doors. There was always an angle, always an unspoken agenda. But here, in this place, none of that existed. And maybe that was why he found himself speaking. "Seems like you're a regular here." She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his with no flicker of surprise, no guarded hesitation. Just a quiet acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting for him to say something all along. "You could say that," she said, setting her spoon down and tilting her head slightly. "I stop by whenever I'm driving back from my parents' place. Habit, I guess." He nodded, glancing briefly at the rain outside before returning his gaze to her. "Must be a good habit. This place has a certain charm." She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of polite, obligatory smile people gave out of courtesy. It was small, genuine, touched with amusement. That's a very kind way of putting it. Most people would just call it outdated. Outdated isn't always bad. "Guess that depends on what you're comparing it to," she said, taking another sip of her coffee. Her voice was even, unassuming, yet there was something about the way she spoke that made him want to keep talking. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying at all, and that, more than anything, was what intrigued him. He let the silence stretch for a moment before he asked, "So, do you just come here for the coffee, or is there another reason you keep coming back?" She considered the question, as if no one had ever asked her that before. Maybe it's nostalgia. Maybe it's just comfortable. There's something nice about having a place that doesn't change, you know? He did know. Though his world was built on innovation, on constant movement, on the pursuit of whatever came next, there was a part of him that longed for something steady, something that didn't shift beneath him every time he took a step forward. "What about you?" she asked suddenly. "You don't seem like a regular." It was a casual remark, but he felt the weight of it more than he expected. He could have lied, could have said he had just been passing through, that he had stopped in on a whim, but for some reason he didn't. "Bad day," he admitted, leaning back slightly, his fingers still curled around his cup. "One thing after another, and somehow I ended up here." She nodded, as if she understood without needing details. That's not the worst way to end up somewhere. He studied her for a moment. There was no prying in her expression, no expectation that he explain further. She simply accepted what he had given her and left the rest alone. That kind of restraint was rare. Most people, upon recognizing an opportunity to dig, would press further, eager to uncover more than what was offered. But she didn't. And that made him want to tell her more. "You ever have one of those days where nothing goes as planned?" he asked. She gave a short laugh, setting her cup down. "More than I'd like to admit, though I think that's just life's way of keeping us from getting too comfortable. Or reminding us that we're not as in control as we think we are." That, too. A beat of silence passed between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like the kind of pause that naturally settled into conversations when both people were simply present, not rushing to fill the space with unnecessary words. For the first time in a long while, Olivier felt himself relax. Not in the way he did at a private villa in the Mediterranean, or on the terrace of some high-rise suite surrounded by luxury. This was different. It was an ease that had nothing to do with wealth or power, nothing to do with status or expectations. It was just simple. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he didn't want it to end. The first time Olivier saw her again, it wasn't by accident. He told himself it was. He convinced himself that it was just coincidence, that he had simply been driving with no particular destination in mind and had somehow ended up near that same roadside cafe. But deep down, he knew better. Something about that evening had stayed with him. The ease of it, the simplicity, the way Ava had looked at him without expectation, without calculation. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him like that, without an agenda, without an awareness of who he was or what he could offer them. And that was exactly why he hadn't told her the truth. That first night, sitting in the cafe in a set of work coveralls, sipping burnt coffee under flickering fluorescent lights, had been the first time in a long while he had felt like just another man. Not a CEO, not a billionaire, not a name that people whispered with awe or envy. Just a man. So when she had asked if he was new in town, he had hesitated for only a moment before saying something like that. It wasn't a full lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Now, a week later, he found himself pulling into the same parking lot, his hands tightening around the steering wheel as if he could somehow justify the choice by sheer force of will. He had taken steps to make himself blend in. The sleek sports cars that usually filled his garages remained untouched. Instead, he had bought a used Ford pickup, something unremarkable, something that wouldn't draw attention. His wardrobe had undergone a similar transformation. Gone were the tailored suits, the custom shoes, the polished accessories. In their place, simple jeans, plain t-shirts, an old leather jacket that looked as if it had seen better days. It was a disguise, but it was also something else, a chance to step outside of his own life. As he stepped inside the cafe again, the bell above the door gave that same familiar jingle. The place was unchanged, just as she had said, comfortably outdated, untouched by the rapid modernization of the world outside. And then, there she was. Ava sat in the same spot as before, a book open in front of her, one hand resting lightly against her temple as she read. The overhead light cast a warm glow on her dark curls, highlighting the smooth line of her cheekbone, the absent way she tapped her finger against the page as if following the rhythm of some unheard song. She looked up as the door closed behind him, her eyes meeting his for the briefest moment. And then she smiled. It wasn't a surprise smile, not a questioning one either. Just an acknowledgement, a recognition, as if she had already known he would come back. He took the seat beside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Twice in 1 week," she said, closing her book with a quiet thud. "You sure you're not turning into a regular?" He smirked slightly, shaking his head. "Not sure yet, but the coffee's growing on me." She tilted her head, studying him with an amused glance. "That would be the first time I've heard anyone say that about this place." Linda, the ever-efficient waitress, materialized with a coffee pot in hand. She didn't even ask this time, just poured him a cup, giving him a knowing look before walking away. Ava leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the counter. "So, are you actually new in town, or are you just passing through?" Olivier hesitated, feeling the weight of the question more than he should have. In his world, lying was a skill as much as it was a necessity. Deals weren't made on honesty alone. Conversations were carefully measured, words chosen with precision. But this wasn't a negotiation, and Ava wasn't someone he needed to outmaneuver. And yet, he still couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. "I guess you could say I'm figuring things out," he said eventually, watching as she lifted her coffee to her lips. She didn't press for details. That was the thing about her. She never asked too many questions. She let the silences breathe, let the moments stretch between them without trying to fill them with unnecessary words. It was a dangerous kind of ease, the kind that made him forget himself. Over the next hour, they talked. Not about anything particularly important. Just the small, inconsequential things that made the conversations effortless. The worst movies they'd ever seen. The best road trips. The places they wanted to visit someday. She told him about the way she always took the long way home after visiting her parents, just for the sake of driving with no destination in mind. He told her about a town he had passed through once, without mentioning the fact that he had stayed in a penthouse suite overlooking the entire city. And then, just like before, the time slipped away. By the time they stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and crisp. The parking lot was quiet, the neon sign above the diner humming softly in the night. Ava turned to him, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You're an interesting guy, you know that?" He raised an eyebrow. "Not sure if that's a compliment or not." She laughed softly. "It is. Just means I haven't quite figured you out yet." The words sent a quiet jolt through him, though he kept his expression neutral. She hadn't figured him out, and for the first time in his life he wasn't sure if he wanted her to. The weeks passed like the turning pages of a novel he didn't want to end. Olivier had always lived in a world of schedules, appointments, meticulously planned itineraries. His life had been defined by structure, by purpose, by the ceaseless drive for the next achievement. But with Ava, there was none of that. No deadlines, no expectations, just moments, unrushed, uncalculated. He found himself seeking her out, returning to that same cafe under the pretense of habit, though he knew it was something else entirely. He had no reason to be there, no excuse to keep showing up, but he did anyway, and every time she greeted him as if he had always belonged there. They slipped into a rhythm so naturally it was almost alarming. Some nights they sat inside the cafe, sipping coffee and talking about nothing in particular. Other nights they walked, along quiet streets, past dimly lit storefronts, the distant hum of the city lingering in the air. He learned that she loved the smell of bookstores, that she had a terrible habit of singing along to the radio without knowing the lyrics, that she hated olives but ate them anyway if they were in something she didn't want to waste. She learned that he preferred his coffee black, that he never took the same route home twice, that he had a tendency to fall silent when he was lost in thought. And yet, for all the things they shared, there were just as many things left unsaid. Because Olivier wasn't just another man. And this wasn't just another story. Every time he was with her, he played a part. He let her believe he was someone simpler, someone unburdened by wealth and influence. He wore second-hand jeans and scuffed boots, drove a car that looked like it belonged to another lifetime. He spoke in careful words, always aware of the lines he couldn't cross, the truths he couldn't reveal. It should have felt like deception. It should have made him uncomfortable. But instead, it felt like freedom. For the first time in years, he was living outside the weight of expectation. No one whispered his name when he walked into the cafe. No one cared about the numbers in his bank account, the headlines bearing his face. He wasn't Olivier Blake, billionaire entrepreneur. He was just Olivier. And for the first time, that was enough. But even as he let himself sink into this borrowed reality, cracks began to form. There were questions he had no answers for. Ava never pried, never demanded explanations, but she noticed things, the way he never talked about work and specifics, the way he avoided introducing her to friends or inviting her into his life beyond these stolen moments. At first, she didn't push. She let him keep his secrets. But secrets have a way of growing heavy. One evening, as they sat outside on the hood of his truck, watching the headlights of passing cars blur against the night, she turned to him with quiet curiosity. "You ever wonder what your life would be like if things had gone differently?" He didn't answer right away. He knew what she meant. If he had grown up somewhere else, if he had made different choices, if he hadn't built the empire that now defined him. "Sometimes," he admitted. She nodded as if she understood, though she couldn't possibly know just how much weight that question carried. "I think about that, too," she said. "How one decision can change everything. How sometimes you don't even realize it until it's too late to turn back." He looked at her then, at the way the dim light caught in her hair, at the way she spoke as if she had already accepted that life was a series of irreversible choices. And for the first time since he had met her, he wondered if she had secrets of her own. But he didn't ask. Because to ask her would mean opening himself up in return. And he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The realization came slowly, not in a sudden moment of clarity, but in quiet, persistent thoughts that refused to leave him alone. Olivier had spent years convincing himself that love, real love, was something out of reach for a man like him. He had seen too much artifice, too much carefully disguised greed, too many people who wanted what he could give rather than who he was. He had stopped believing in the idea that someone could love him for anything other than the name attached to his fortune. And yet, here she was. Ava, with her quiet curiosity and her unshaken ease, her laughter that came without effort, her way of looking at him like he was simply a man, not a commodity. She had slipped into his life without warning, and now the thought of a day without her felt strange, like an absence he couldn't quite reconcile. He had fallen in love with her before he even realized it had happened. The thought unsettled him, not because he didn't want it to be true, but because he knew what it meant. Love required honesty. It required trust. And he had built their entire foundation on a carefully crafted lie. But the longer he kept it hidden, the harder it became to reveal. It was a paradox. Every moment he spent with her made it both more necessary and more impossible to tell her the truth. He feared that the moment she found out, everything they had built would collapse. That she would look at him the way so many others had, her expression shifting from warmth to calculation, as if finally understanding what she stood to gain. Or worse, that she would walk away. And so he said nothing. Instead, he did what he had always done. He focused on control. If he could maintain the illusion, if he could keep their world contained within the walls of late-night conversations and quiet afternoons, then maybe, just maybe, he could hold on to her a little longer. But love, by its very nature, demands more. The night he proposed was not planned, not in the way he had planned everything else in his life. There was no grand gesture, no diamond ring hidden in a velvet box, no lavish setting designed to impress. There was only them, standing beneath the glow of a street lamp on an empty road, the air cool with the promise of autumn. They had spent the evening as they always did, talking, walking, existing in that unspoken space between what they were and what they could be. She had been laughing at something, her breath visible in the night air, when he caught himself staring at her in that way that felt dangerous. And then, before he could stop himself, the words were there. "Marry me?" She stopped, the laughter fading from her lips as her eyes searched his face. For a moment, the world seemed to still. "You're serious," she said, her voice quiet, as if testing the weight of his words. He was. He had never been more serious about anything in his life. She didn't ask for time to think. She didn't hesitate or analyze or question. She just smiled. And then she said yes. The relief that crashed over him was immediate, intoxicating. But beneath it, buried deep where he refused to acknowledge it, was something else. Dread. Because in that moment, as she wrapped her arms around him, as she whispered something he couldn't quite hear against his shoulder, he knew what he had done. He had given her his future without giving her his truth. And sooner or later, the truth always finds a way out. The days following Ava's acceptance of his proposal were filled with a strange mixture of exhilaration and unease. Olivier had expected to feel relief, to finally have something solid, something real, something that belonged to him outside of boardrooms and stock tickers and the relentless pursuit of more. And in some ways, he did. Waking up to the thought of her as his fiancée sent an unfamiliar warmth through him, a quiet sense of certainty that he had never known before. But beneath it all, the lie loomed like a shadow. He had thought about telling her. More than once, he had opened his mouth, only to close it again, the words dissolving on his tongue before they could take shape. Every day that passed made the weight of it heavier, and yet, every day, he convinced himself that it wasn't the right time. Not yet. Instead, he threw himself into the logistics of the wedding, using the details as a distraction. Ava didn't ask for anything extravagant. If anything, she seemed almost wary of too much attention. She wanted something simple, something intimate. When he had cautiously suggested a courthouse wedding, testing whether she might be relieved to avoid the fanfare, she had smiled and shaken her head. "Not that simple," she had said, "but something that feels like us." She still didn't know who us really was. Olivier had spent his life crafting the illusion of control. Every business deal, Every financial decision, every move he made in the public eye had been calculated, precise. He had built an empire on knowing how to manipulate perception, how to make people see only what he wanted them to see. But this wasn't business, and Ava wasn't someone he could outmaneuver. She wasn't the kind of woman who would be impressed by grand gestures or placated by carefully worded explanations. When she found out, there would be no spinning it, no rewriting the narrative. She would either accept him for who he really was, or she would walk away. And the thought of losing her had become something he couldn't bear to consider. So he let the deception continue. The first real challenge came in the form of her parents. They had never met before. Ava had spoken of them, of course, but Olivier had always managed to avoid situations where introductions might have been necessary. Now, though, it was unavoidable. A wedding meant families, and families meant questions. He knew how to handle people. He had spent years perfecting the skill. But there was something different about this. There was no buffer of wealth, no barrier of status to hide behind. He couldn't deflect with carefully curated charm or let his reputation do the work for him. He had to be just Olivier. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if that would be enough. They met for dinner at a small restaurant just outside the city, the kind of place that felt more like a home than a business. The walls were lined with old photographs, the lighting dim but warm, the air filled with the scent of herbs and slow-cooked meals. Ava's father, Robert, was a quiet man, his presence steady but reserved. He had the kind of gaze that saw straight through pretenses, the kind of patience that came from years of knowing when to speak and when to simply listen. Her mother, Diane, was different, sharp-eyed and watchful, her words measured but not unkind. She smiled when appropriate, laughed in the right places, but there was something else beneath the surface, a quiet skepticism, a lingering question that she hadn't yet voiced. Olivier had expected scrutiny. What he hadn't expected was the way it unsettled him. He was used to being evaluated, to being analyzed. In business, it was an advantage. Knowing that people were always trying to figure him out gave him the upper hand. But here, sitting across from Ava's parents, he felt none of that control. Because this wasn't about money. This was about their daughter. And no matter how well he played his role, some part of them could sense it. Something just slightly off, something unspoken. Diane was the first to voice it. "So, Olivier," she said, somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, her gaze steady. "Ava tells us you've been doing some contracting work?" He had rehearsed this part, had practiced the details of the life he had created for himself in this version of reality. "That's right," he said, keeping his tone even. "Mostly independent jobs, project-based work, keeps things flexible." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Ava smiled beside him, completely unaware of the tension tightening in his chest. "He's one of those people who never stays in one place for too long," she said lightly, always moving on to the next thing. Diane hummed in acknowledgement, but her expression didn't change, and Robert, who had remained mostly quiet up until that point, finally spoke. "That's a hard way to build a future." The words were simple, not an accusation, not a challenge, just a quiet observation. Olivier met his gaze, something flickering between them, a silent understanding, a recognition. Ava's father knew what it was to build something, and he could see, somehow, impossibly, that Olivier was not the kind of man who drifted without purpose. It was a dangerous moment, teetering on the edge of revelation. So Olivier did the only thing he could. He lied. "It has its challenges," he admitted, "but I like the freedom of it." It was enough, for now. The rest of the evening passed smoothly, but the weight of the conversation lingered long after they left the restaurant. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Ava rested her head against his shoulder, her fingers tracing absent patterns against his arm. "They like you," she murmured sleepily. He swallowed against the knot in his throat. "Yeah?" She nodded. "Even my mom, and she's the toughest critic I know." He exhaled, pressing a kiss to her hair, letting himself believe, just for a moment, that it was real. That the version of himself he had given her was enough, that the truth wouldn't destroy everything, but deep down he knew better. Lies have a way of unraveling. And his was already starting to fray at the edges. The morning of the wedding arrived with an unsettling stillness. Olivier stood at the window of his modest hotel room, staring out at the quiet streets below. The sky was an expanse of soft gray, thick with the weight of an impending storm that had yet to break. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady the unease pooling in his chest. Today was the day. In a few short hours, he would stand before Ava and make a promise that, in every way that mattered, he had already broken. He had spent the past week suffocating under the weight of his own deception, the walls of his carefully crafted lie closing in on him from all sides. Every time she looked at him with that unshaken trust, every time she reached for his hand without hesitation, it burned. And yet, even now, even as the inevitability of the truth loomed over him, he still feared losing her more than he feared confessing. A sharp knock on the door cut through his thoughts. He turned, forcing himself back into the present. His best man, if he could even call him that, stood in the doorway, a smirk playing at his lips. Thomas Ellis was one of the few people in Olivier's world who knew the truth. He was an old friend, someone who had been with him long before the money, before the empire. And right now, he looked thoroughly unimpressed. "You look like a man about to be sentenced," Thomas said, stepping inside. Not exactly the look of a groom ready to walk down the aisle. Olivier sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not that simple." Thomas scoffed. "Oh, it's exactly that simple. You either tell her before the ceremony, or she finds out after, and then you're screwed." Olivier didn't respond. Because the truth was, he didn't know if there was a right answer anymore. The venue was small, intimate, just as Ava had wanted. A little courtyard behind the cafe where they had first met, strung with soft lights, surrounded by people who mattered. Her family, her friends. A handful of his own, though most of them still didn't understand why he had insisted on keeping things so low-key. He stood at the altar, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, watching as she walked toward him. She was beautiful, not in the artificial, polished way that so many women in his world tried to be, but in the way that was simply her. No designer gown, no grand entrance. Just Ava, in a simple white dress, smiling at him as if she had no doubt in the world. It shattered something inside him. He couldn't do this. Not like this. The officiant began speaking, but Olivier barely heard a word. His pulse thundered in his ears, his thoughts a blur of panic and inevitability. And then, before he could stop himself, before he could let another moment slip away, he turned to her. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through the air. The officiant hesitated, clearly thrown off by the interruption, but Ava didn't flinch. She looked at him, waiting. Olivier swallowed hard, forcing the words out before he could stop himself. "I haven't been honest with you," he said, "about who I am, About what I do. About my life. Silence. His heart pounded violently against his ribs, but he pushed forward. My name is Olivier Blake. I'm not a contractor. I don't live paycheck to paycheck. I own one of the largest technology companies in the country, and He exhaled sharply, voice shaking. I lied because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you wouldn't see me anymore. That you'd only see what everyone else does. Ava didn't speak. She just stood there, her expression unreadable. His chest tightened. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then, slowly, she took a breath. I know. The words hit him like a physical blow. He blinked, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. You, what? Ava let out a soft sigh, shaking her head. Olivier, I'm not an idiot. I noticed the way you spoke, the way you carried yourself, the little things that didn't quite add up. Your watch, your shoes, the way you never actually answered certain questions. He could only stare at her. I wasn't sure at first, she continued, but I started to put the pieces together. I didn't say anything because I was waiting. Her voice softened. Waiting for you to tell me the truth. A sharp, incredulous laugh escaped him. And you still said yes? She hesitated, then nodded. Because I fell in love with the man in front of me. Not the money, not the company, you. Something inside him cracked. For so long, he had lived in the shadow of his own success, convinced that no one could ever love him without seeing the wealth first. He had built walls around himself, thinking they would protect him, never realizing they had only trapped him in his own fear. And yet, here she was, not angry, not betrayed, just understanding. So, she said after a long moment, a teasing lilt in her voice, are we still getting married or what? The breath he had been holding finally escaped in a short, astonished laugh. And then, without another word, he kissed her. The guests erupted into cheers, the officiant chuckled in relief, and just like that, the moment was no longer about secrets or lies. It was about them. And for the first time, Olivier really knew, that he didn't have to be anyone other than himself. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out our other videos for more stories like this, and if you enjoyed this one, share it with your friends.